So this is a quick screencast, actually probably be a little bit longer than a quick one, about the polis. And remember, the polis is the city-state, and the city-state is something like Athens or Sparta. We could have called Mycenae a city-state as well. Here's a map of Greece, or at least the Aegean region at the time of the city-state. We see that we have Athens and Sparta. Here's Troy still, Mount Olympus. Okay, Athens here, notice its location on the coast. Sparta is deep within the mountains, and the geography is going to be significantly influential on the development of both of them. Here's a little bit more detailed map of the region. Note here the Persian Empire. The Persians are going to have a big role to play in the age of the city-state. They are not Greeks. They come from Asia, and their influence spreads all the way around the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's all the Greek settlements we learned about how they formed colonies as they came out of the Dark Ages. And these colonies actually stretched all the way as far as Italy. So Greece is becoming more expansive. Now, there is no country called Greece. It's a region of Greece. And Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Syracuse and Miletus, these are all separate city-states. One thing that sets the city-state apart from everything that had come before it was this idea of citizenship. Agamemnon, as the king in Mycenae, he did not have citizens in Mycenae, he had subjects. In other words, the people of Mycenae were simply beholden to whatever Agamemnon told them to do. They didn't have any kind of a stake in society. But the polis, or the city-state, is built on the idea that all free men had a stake in society. In other words, they had to participate in society. This gave them both rights, but responsibilities as well. In other words, the success of the city-state depended upon them. In this city-state, though, we still see that we had the institution of slavery. So when we start thinking about the city-state, and indeed later we're going to actually look at something called democracy, we have to keep in mind that there's nothing close to democracy that we understand it, because there's still slavery. Slavery is pretty expansive throughout the ancient world, and the Greeks were no different. One theory about how this concept of citizenship grew is called the hoplite theory. Now, the hoplite is a warrior, a Greek warrior that uses a shield and a spear, and lines up right next to fellow soldiers in what's called a phalanx. In other words, the success of the army depended upon everybody pitching in together. Very much like a democracy. If you couldn't cover yourself completely with your shield, but your shield would help to cover the guy next to you. So everybody held their shield with one arm, usually their left arm, and then the spear with the right arm, and then they would advance, and it was like one big unit. Hoplite armies got bigger and bigger as iron became more prevalent. It was cheaper and easier to get iron to build a shield or a spear, and therefore more hoplite soldiers were available to participate in defending the polis, or defending the city-state. This is probably a pretty true theory, the idea that as soldiers became more and more involved in the defense of the polis, as more and more soldiers became involved in the defense, more and more people wanted a stake in society. What's more likely is simply just the lower classes began to participate more and more in the military, and therefore expected to have more and more of a say. Increasingly demanded to participate in the decisions of government. So we see in all the city-states of ancient Greece in this period of time we call the Archaic Age, we see this concept of citizenship, even though the governments might be a little bit different one to the next. We're going to look at two city-states in particular. In this day and age of citizenship, we have to understand that women did not really have much of a say. They were very inferior to men. Their job was to raise families. In fact, they needed large dowries simply to get married to men. This shows you what society thought of women, that when you married a woman, you were entitled to be paid in order to pay for feeding her, I guess, and the expense of having a wife. The family needed to be compensated. Women were also considered the property of their husband. Of quite literally by law, the property of their husband. So the first city-state we want to look at is Sparta. And you may know something of Sparta because it's popularly shown in movies these days as a very serious warrior culture, and indeed it was. Spartan government was considered an oligarchy, and oligarchy is rule of the few. So oligarchy is rule of the few, and if you take economics down the road, you'll see oligopoly is an economy based upon the few. Sparta was ruled not by all, but by a few. So Sparta actually had a king, actually a pair of kings. They were the head of the military, and they didn't really do too much in terms of the government. Really all the power in the government was in a council of elders. 28 elders were picked of all the Spartan men above the age of 60. So the elders were in charge. In this council of elders was a group of 5 men called ephors, and they were charged with sort of enacting the decisions of the elders. The elders would put proposals out to the assembly of all the freemen of Sparta, and this assembly was called the alike. Now, they were called the alike because it to emphasize the idea that they're all the same. They all have an equal stake in Spartan society. Now, the thing that's interesting is that we have evidence to show that if the alike voted on a proposal in the way that the elders didn't like, or the elders didn't want them to, the elders simply nullified the decision and tried again. In other words, the elders had veto power over anything that the alike decided to do, which is another way of saying the elders had all the power. So the alike was there to ratify whatever the elders told them to do, and that's what makes it an oligarchy. Now, under the alike, all the freemen of Sparta was a class of slaves called the helot slaves. The helot slaves did all the domestic work in Sparta. They basically worked the farms. This allowed all the men to be free to participate in the only obligation they had in Sparta, which was to be in the military. The helots could be beaten, they could be killed, and they also served to remind the alike that the alike were not at the bottom of Spartan society. There was a huge class of slaves underneath them. And as we just said, the Spartan community was based on the military. They were up in the mountains, and they were quite isolated and therefore quite defensive, and they were super soldiers. All Spartan men were soldiers. In fact, they started training to be a soldier at the age of 7. Some of the sources we see show that Spartan boys were put out on their own at the age of 7 to survive in the middle of winter up on the mountainside. Now, if they didn't, you can imagine that plenty of them didn't, the thought was, well, that was just as well. We're weeding out the weaker males so that we can only have a strong military. Very, very rough. Sometimes you hear the word Spartan used as an adjective to describe tough. They didn't go in for any real kind of art or literature or anything like that. Really, their calling was to be a soldier. The women in Sparta, though, actually had an interesting role. They were somewhat respected, at least better than in the other city-states around. The reason they were respected was because they had to basically control the helot slaves and control the Spartan homesteads while all the men were off soldiering. Women were the creators of the Spartan army. In other words, they gave birth to Spartan soldiers. That was their job, to give birth to Spartan soldiers, and also to train these boys in Spartan values of commitment and dedication. So women actually had a more respected role in Spartan society than other places. But to give you an idea of just how fierce Sparta was, there is a 7th century source where that tells the story of a mother telling her son going off to war, come back with your shield or on it. In other words, come back with your shield victorious or come back dead on your shield. You would have been carried back on your shield if you were killed in battle. In other words, death or glory were your choices in Spartan life. Surrender was not. Fairly Mycenaean, I guess, in that regard. Success in battle is where you got glory. Certainly a tough way to live, but certainly a very successful way to live. They were considered just brilliant soldiers.